Because Jesus is risen, the way to God is open. We see in the first part of the Bible, the Old Testament, that's the part that was written before Jesus was born. We see there that God promised to make a way to lead his people back to him. It was a way that would bring his scattered people back home to their God. And prophets, such as prophet Isaiah, they were like signposts pointing to this way. And God promised that he would send a leader to gather his people, to lead his people back to himself, back home. But even the best of those leaders, the best of the prophets in the Old Testament, the best of the priests, the best of the kings, the leaders, even those in the Old Testament couldn't fulfill this role of leading God's people on the way back to God, back home. At best, they were like signposts to the way, not the way itself. And so we finish reading the Old Testament longing for this promised way, longing for this promised person, this promised leader to lead God's people back home. And Jesus comes, as we read into the New Testament, Jesus comes and says, I am the way. Jesus was unique. Jesus didn't speak like he was just a signpost pointing to the way. Jesus said, I am the way. He is the way that was promised. The only way back home, back to God. In John's Gospel, the part that we read earlier, the language of home is used. Jesus is the only way back to his Father's house. And you might remember that prophets like Isaiah promised that one day a new creation would come, a new heavens and a new earth, a new home for all those who follow God. And Jesus says that to follow him is the only way to find our future home in the kind of world that we all want. And yet also the wonderful thing is that Jesus isn't simply the way for us to be at home with God in the future. He's the way for us to know God today and to be part of God's family today. Jesus is the promised way, and Jesus is the present way. The writer to the Hebrews puts it like this: Therefore, brothers and sisters, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart and with the full assurance that faith brings, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience and having our bodies washed with pure water. Because Jesus is risen, the way to God is open. Because Jesus is risen, we can trust what he says. If we're going to follow someone, then it's really important that we know that they're telling the truth. We need to know, if we're following someone, that they're not lying. We need to know that they're not mistaken. And in the Bible, we see that Jesus tells us the truth. Jesus tells us the truth about God, and he tells us the truth about ourselves. He tells us the truth about human beings. He tells us what God is really like, and he tells us the truth about what we as human beings are really like, the good bits, and he tells us the truth about the bad bits of our lives, the sin in our lives. And truth is not just facts that are true. It's not just stories that are real. Jesus does tell us the truth. Jesus is giving us true things to know in our heads. But it's more than that. Jesus is a person to truly know. This morning we're spending a lot of time in John's Gospel, and earlier in his Gospel, right at the start, in some words that we often read at Christmas rather than Easter, it says this: "The Word, Jesus, became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Jesus doesn't just tell us the truth about God, he reveals God to us. He enables us to truly know God because Jesus is God. Even as Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, the life. I am. Even as he says that, it's an allusion to God's name, deliberately. Jesus' claim to be the truth was proven when he was raised from the dead. And we see that Jesus told his disciples that what happened was just as he said it would happen. So Jesus tells the truth, and we can trust Jesus' truth. You know, the disciples who witnessed Jesus being raised to life, they then built all of the rest of their lives upon following him. And that was even when following Jesus came for them at great cost. But because Jesus is risen, they knew that they could trust what Jesus said. And now we have the true words of Jesus written down for us in the Bible. So we can trust the written truth about Jesus. And so we, like those disciples, we can build our lives on God's word in the Bible, even when that comes at great cost, because Jesus is risen. Because Jesus is risen, we can trust what he says. Jesus is the way, and Jesus is the truth. Because Jesus is risen, we can have life with God now and forever. As Ailey said, on that first Easter Sunday, Jesus' heart started beating again. The grave couldn't hold him. Death was defeated. Jesus was alive. And that shows us something amazing, that Jesus won the victory over death. And so he can give those who follow him real life after we die, which we will. Jesus gives us life into eternity. If we read a little bit earlier in John's Gospel in chapter 11, we would read that Jesus said, I am, there's that phrase again, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. I'm a pastor, as you know, and as pastors from time to time, we have the privilege of being involved in leading the funerals of those who have been part of the church and who die. And as a pastor at the burial, we stand by the graveside and we say those words of Jesus as the coffin is lowered into the grave. Because of Jesus, because of his death and resurrection to life, death no longer has the final word. That is not the end of the story. You know, it has been rightly said that for those who follow Jesus, who trust in him, that when they die, it's like a seed being planted in the ground. Standing around the grave, we witness not just a burial, but a planting. Like a planting of a seed. Because one day when Jesus returns, he will gather in the harvest of his people as he raises us to new life in a renewed creation. It's not wishful thinking. It is certain hope. How do we know that? Because Jesus himself was the first fruits of that harvest that is still to come. He was the first fruits as he died and was raised to life 3 days later. Jesus gives life into eternity, but Jesus also gives life today. He brings those who are spiritually dead to God, he brings us to new life with God. Because Jesus is risen, life with God is possible now and forever. If you've been with us over this month, last month of March, you know that we've been asking the question, ever feel like something is missing? And we've been inviting people to find the life that they're looking for in Jesus. Purpose, belonging, rest, authenticity, peace, satisfaction, freedom, hope, well-being. And we've seen that the only way to find the life that we're looking for is to find it in Jesus, to find life in Jesus. And as we move into this summer term, we'll be hearing from the teaching of Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount as David Upton, one of the other pastors, as he preaches from Matthew's Gospel, sharing Jesus' invitation to flourish with us. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Because Jesus is risen, the way to God is open. Because Jesus is risen, we can trust what he says. And because Jesus is risen, we can have life with God now and forever.